This is a review of Chapter 10 on qualitative research. So, some of the things that are important to understand about qualitative research is that it takes place in the natural world. It takes place where students are in teacher lounges, in schools, on athletics fields, or in the community wherever students and teachers interact. It uses multiple methods of data collection, such as the researcher immersing herself into the environment, uh, interviews, observations, and each of these methods are interactive and humanistic. Qualitative research is emergent rather than tightly prefigured. So while I have been talking about the importance of uh, really being planful in quantitative research and being very clear about the type of data to collect, the research procedures to be using. That sounds very tight and pre-configured. It is also very planfully done in qualitative research, but there is an element of qualitative research that is, as I said, more interactive and is fundamentally interpretive, meaning that as we move along and as we determine that certain strategies have to be changed or adapted, the researcher has the kind of the freedom to do that, and the researcher will note this in their logs so that as people begin to wonder afterwards why they did that, that there is a clear and specific reason for the decision that the researcher made along the way. The other parts that are important about qualitative research is that it views social phenomena holistically. And the other part of it is that the researcher is typically immersed into the environment, and therefore, throughout the investigation or the inquiry, the researcher systematically and consistently reflects on their own role in the inquiry process. How might my presence influence the data that I'm collecting, the conversations that I have, the observations that I do? And we are sensitive to our own biography as we conduct the study. For instance, when I did my doctoral dissertation, I studied adolescents who were placed into residential treatment facility, and the study was titled Adolescents' Perceptions of Success. In order to control for some of this personal bias and biography that I brought to the study, I did interview young people in the facility where I worked myself, but I also interviewed young people in two other residential facilities in order to kind of check to see if I would get the same findings or the same perceptions of young people in in these other environments, which I absolutely ended up getting. So the purpose of a qualitative research is to develop a concept or a model. So, for instance, what I was interested in my study was developing a model of how do students know that they have been successful and that they are ready to return to the community and not repeating the problematic behaviors, the repeated patterns of self-defeating behaviors that eventually had gotten them to the residential facility. It can also be to describe a process or a situation. It can be to criticize cultural practices and beliefs. A number of critical studies, as they are called, are done, to explore or to disclose cultural practices and beliefs that might not be beneficial. So, for instance, a number of studies, qualitative studies, has been done in the DLBTQ community in order to uh, disclose how many GLBTQ students are being discriminated against in their environment. Can also be done to evaluate a program, to identify a policy issue, or to contribute to large scale projects. Qualitative research is often being used as a precursor to quantitative research in order to kind of map out what the issues are in a particular situation. As I mentioned before, qualitative researchers have prolonged and close relationships with the participants in the study, and they pursue what we call an insider or an emic perspective. Emic means an insider view. It includes accounts, descriptions, and analysis that is expressed in terms of the conceptual schemes and categories regarded as meaningful and appropriate by members of the culture, as Led said. So the emic perspective is really trying to get at how do people experience the topic that we are currently investigating. So qualitative research methods also are constantly adapted to the insights that we gain along the way. So there is an emergent nature to the types of questions or observations that are done during the research project. Another important difference is that qualitative research findings are idiographic and not nomothetic, meaning that the study findings can only be applied to the concrete situation where they were done. So they cannot be generalized. We know that in quantitative research, one of the primary kind of standards that we are looking for is are the findings generalizable, to the population. So we collect the sample and we are really looking for being able to make observations about or findings, interpretations about the general population. We cannot do that in qualitative research. Actually, this burden of generalizability in qualitative research falls upon the reader or the user of the research. So let's say, go back to the study that formed the foundation for my dissertation, Adolescents' Perceptions of Success. Other people who might be working in residential facilities could read my study and could say, yeah, based on the very detailed descriptions of these residential facilities, the types of children are there, and the types of support and programming strategies and interventions that were delivered in these environments, they are similar enough to what we are doing in my residential facility, and therefore it is reasonable for me to assume that the conclusions that was found in the study can also be used in my environment. So qualitative research also assumes that our realities, our social realities, are social constructs, and that they become a consensus in a particular group of people or an environment where we study a topic. Qualitative data is what we call deep and rich. We are really looking for an in-depth understanding of a single social phenomenon. For instance, I did another qualitative research. There's a lot of documentation in the resiliency literature that one of the key protective factors for high-risk kid is a significant relationship with a positive, caring adult. It's been confirmed again and again and again. But how do we know what a significant, caring adult looks like? So, in order to explore that, I interviewed about 25 high risk students about with the purpose to investigate and explore from their perspective what are the behaviors that an adult engages in that sends the message to the young person that I care about you. And from that research, I wrote an article called The 7 Habits of Caring Relationship, because this is what emerged from the finding that adults engaged in 7 typical types of relationships that send the message to young people that they are cared about or cared for. So I have mentioned in an earlier chapter that one of the things, the sampling strategies that is essential to qualitative research is what is called purposive or purposeful sampling. We are purposefully selecting what we call information-rich informants for the study. So we purposefully go out, for instance, when I was interested in finding out what caring relationships look like, one of the qualifiers for students to participate in the study was that they could identify, excuse me, in detail an adult who cared about them. Um, so the logic of purposeful sampling is that the first few cases studied in depth yield insights about the topic. And therefore, as we begin to use this purposeful sampling, we are likely to gain information about the topic under investigation. So there are different strategies that we use in order to get at purposeful sampling. First, we have this notion about that we have to find the sites where we are conducting our investigation. So as I mentioned to you in my dissertation, I found 3 residential facilities in Virginia whose programming was close enough and the type of children was approximating one another that it would be reasonable to assume that interviewing young people in each of these 3 facilities would gain us a purposeful sample. Sometimes we then engage in what we call comprehensive sampling, where we choose an entire group by a certain criteria. So in my dissertation, I was looking at kids who, one, were in a residential facility, two, who were in what was known in each of these programs in the working phase of the program, and three, that there was agreement by the adults in the facility, at least 3 adults, that these children who were going to be in the study were in the working phase. And the last criteria was that the young people would be willing to talk with me in a sense that they gave assent, and then next that I could get consent from their legal guardian for them to participate in the study. We have previously talked about network sampling, which is the notion about that once that I had interviewed a number of students, I asked them who else they thought would be able to talk about the topic, and then I went back and confirmed with the adults in the environment that they also believed that these young people would be information-rich participants. Sometimes we also use in qualitative research what we call extreme case sampling. After we kind of have found a typical case or an average case, then we go out and say, is there really an outlier here that we are looking for, because we want to make sure that we gain all the participants in the study. We sometimes also do intense case sampling, where we select cases that are intense but not extreme. So let's say that we wanted to explore kids, GLB, a kid who might be gay or lesbian, and we might really want to talk about with them and explore with them how they are being discriminated against. We might want to sample young people who have experienced intense discrimination, bullying, or exclusion, but we do not want to get to an extreme case, somebody who might be suicidal because of the situation that they are in. Sometimes we use what we call typical case sampling, which is basically someone who appears to be typically reflecting the case or the type of study questions that we are investigating. Sometimes we use unique case sampling, somebody who is really usual or really rare. Sometimes we use reputational case sampling, where we use, it looks a little bit like network sampling, but it is not network sample, because we are really obtaining recommendations of knowledgeable experts in order for us to get the best samples. And sometimes we use critical case sampling, cases that really can use some, illustrate some phenomenon very dramatically or very clearly. We also at times use concept theory based sampling, where we are looking for people who really appear to know about the concept or the question that we are studying, and sometimes we use a combination of all these strategies to get a variation in our sampling strategies. So the question is, whenever we acknowledge that the researcher's biography and biases might be at play, the question is, how do we obtain validity in a qualitative research? And one of the ways that we do that is through prolonged and persistent fieldwork. Think about, as you can think about ethnography, where people are immersed in long periods of times, and this is what we are looking for here. So I might be, for instance, when I was surveying or talking with kids in these other facilities, I spent 3-4 days on their units and in their classrooms with them before I began any kind of conversations of interviews. The next thing that we do is that we use participants' language and verbatim accounts as the data. So we oftentimes we use digital recording, either in the form of audio and video. And another way that we can enhance validity, of course, is that we can have multiple researchers who are collecting information, conducting interviews, or doing observations on site. Now, how can we enhance validity? Oftentimes in qualitative research, people use what they call participant researchers. They simply find a articulate person who is part of the ecology or the environment that we are investigating, and they have a co-researcher who is one of the participants. There have been several research done, for instance, of qualitative research done on gang-related activities, where you actually engage maybe a reformed gang member to kind of help you gain entry into the field, and they become a co-participant researcher with you. Another way that we try to enhance validity in qualitative research is through member checking. So, for instance, after I had conducted my interviews in both of the qualitative researches I have referenced, I went back to the young people and I showed them the transcripts, sat down and reviewed the transcripts of the interviews with them, and asked them if there was anything else that they wanted to add. And upon my tentative findings of the study, I went back and created some uh, focus group where I began to have some of the participants review the findings that I had um, deduced, induced, inductive methodology, not deductive, inductive methodology from the data. And then finally, sometimes we go in and we try to look for some negative cases, or we are looking for some discrepant data. We are looking for data that is not consistent with the majority of the findings. In my dissertation study, one of the things that I found was that there actually were certain findings that related only to the females who were involved in the study, which ended up being closely related to cultural norms that are prevalent in this country. There are also some other ways to minimize research bias in a qualitative studies. One of the most common ways is a peer debriefer. It is a person who is familiar with research methodology, and whenever you are beginning to develop the patterns of your findings, you meet with your peer debriefer and share with them and discuss with them what you are finding. And they will ask you a lot of the tough questions to make sure that you are not letting your own bias interfere with what the data actually tells you. Uh, Another common way of doing this, I've already referred to it, is a field log. Anytime that I make any decisions about asking different questions, changing observations, as a researcher, you have a field log in which you document any kind of decisions that are being made along the way, as well as a field journal where you might also be reflecting personally about why you made the type of decisions that you did. Sometimes people use what is known as an audit trail. For instance, in my dissertation, I used an audit trail. It's basically was one of my peers who was also pursuing her PhD at the same time. And she came in and she looked at some of the findings that I had had. She then traced it all the way back to the transcribed interviews and then traced it back and listened to the audio tapes of the recordings to make sure that everything had been recorded and analyzed correctly from beginning to end, or actually in this case here, from end and backwards. So what we are looking at when we are evaluating qualitative research is, do the findings appear credible? Are they credible? And that is one of the things that we can make sure as part of the audit trail and as some of the other methods that I just related. The whole question about transferability is the notion about how can we help readers of qualitative research make informed decisions about the findings that we found in our study. And the way we do that is by describing in detail the site we were in and the participants that were used in the study so that people can make informed decisions about whether their situation is close enough to that described in the research report, and therefore it becomes feasible to use the findings in their own place. Dependability is the question about, are we likely, do we get the same data over and over again? That was one of the reasons that I conducted interviews in 3 different settings. Do I get the same kind of statements about how young people perceive that they have been successful in 3 different settings? And then finally, confirmability. Can I go back and can I confirm that what these narrative descriptions or these quotes that are being used, can they be traced back to the participants from the study? Let's look a little bit at what is known as ethnographic research, one of the most common types of uh, qualitative research that is being done. It oftentimes begins with what we call foreshadowed problems, which are really anticipated research problems that will be reformulated as we begin to move into the research. They are broadly phased questions about the setting, what happens, why it happens, and how it happens. And let me give you a couple of examples. Here are a number of foreshadowed problems from Jan Stilwell, whom I worked with in a qualitative research class several years ago. Her research project was titled "Can You Write? Can You Read? An investigation of what at-risk first graders say about writing stories and if this influences their reading." So her broadly foreshadowed problems were, do first grade students who are at risk think that writing helps them learn to read? Or do first grade students who are at risk enjoy writing short stories? And third, how do first grade students who are at risk describe how they learn to read? She interviewed a number of first grade students about this question. Here is another example with some broadly stated problems. To gain from the girls an understanding of the life experiences and events that led them to unacceptable behaviors for which they were referred for agency services. These were girls who were placed into group homes. The second foreshadowed questions, to determine the prevalence of abuse in this population of girls receiving agency services. And the third foreshadowed problem, to explore what differences existed, if any, between delinquent girls receiving services as children in need of services. Here is a third type, or from a third study, some foreshadowed problems. What are the types of worker behaviors that supervisors identify as unsatisfactory? Having identified the problems, what actions do supervisors take in an attempt to resolve problems? And what factors influence the supervisor's decision making during the identification resolution process? So, in ethnographic interviews, we use open-ended response questions to obtain data from participants. We want to explore how they perceive or how they make sense out of important event in their lives. Here are, some examples about how we use these kind of open-ended questions. So we have some questions that did the teachers have difficulty in the seminars? That's clearly a yes no types of question. Another way of asking an open-ended question is, what did you expect teachers to have difficulties with in the seminar? An example of a closed question: were the social workers enthusiastic about the training they received in life space crisis interviewing? Or what did the social workers think was most helpful about the training in life space crisis interviewing? Oftentimes we use in ethnographic research what is known as an interview guide. They are broadly stated topics that we want to make sure that we talk about during the interview. This is the interview guide that I used in my dissertation. So you'll see, first I collected some information about age, where they came from, where it was that location, how long had they been in the facility? Did you live at home before you came here? Were you in a foster home? Were you in a group home? Were you locked up? Were you at a hospital? Etc., etc. Then the next question, a broad type of question, is: could you tell me about what brought you here? Sometimes, if the students were not kind of clear about what brought them there, you see there are some probes that are listed in here. Would your mom, dad, uncle, whoever you were with, add anything to what you just said? Or would they detract anything from what you said? They are just good probes that you have in these broadly stated interview guides that you may use. And then I used a number of what I call future-oriented questions that were: when do you plan to leave the program? How would you know that you are ready to leave? What will be different when you go home? How will your parents, siblings, social workers know that you are ready to leave? What will they say that are different when you go home? So you see, you have these broadly stated questions, but they are not specific. There are also what I called the miracle question, which was a way for them to begin to look at how they knew that they had changed. So the miracle questions goes like this: suppose that a miracle happened while you were sleeping that solves, and then I would insert the main problem that they had identified that they had. You don't know that a miracle happened because you were sleeping. What will be different when you wake up, letting you know that the miracle had happened? And it was amazing how students responded to that question. Then you ask some kind of check questions or reality question. What would it take for you to make that miracle happen? What do you need to do to bring about the miracle, etc.? And then you bring closure at the end of it. And the closure in a qualitative interview is typically: is there anything that you would have liked that I have asked you about, or do you have any additional things that you would like to add? And then here are some references to technology or to places on the internet where you can learn about qualitative research. Thank you.